the history Europe tried to rewrite about Napoleon. In 1815, after the cannons finally fell silent across Europe, something strange began to happen. The man who had terrified kings, redrawn borders, and marched armies across an entire continent was slowly transformed into something simpler, a villain. Not just a defeated emperor, but the embodiment of chaos itself. And for more than 2 centuries, much of the world accepted that version of the story without question. But what if the history of Napoleon Bonaparte was shaped not only by facts, but by the people who needed him to become a monster? What if Europe's most powerful nations rewrote the memory of an entire era to protect themselves? Because when wars end, the battle for history is only beginning. By the spring of 1814, Paris had fallen. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the most feared man in Europe, stood abandoned by many of his allies and exhausted by years of war. Coalition armies entered the French capital while ordinary Parisians watched foreign soldiers walk through their streets for the first time in generations. To Europe's monarchs, Napoleon represented something more dangerous than conquest. He represented instability, revolution, the terrifying idea that kings could fall and ordinary people could rise. And that fear had haunted Europe since the French Revolution exploded in 1789. When Napoleon first appeared on the political stage, he was not born into royalty. He was a Corsican outsider with an Italian accent, mocked by aristocrats and underestimated by nearly everyone around him. Yet within a decade, he would become emperor of the French and dominate continental Europe with astonishing speed. But here is the detail many people forget. Most European powers had already spent years fighting revolutionary France before Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804. The wars did not begin with him. That fact matters because later, narratives often presented Napoleon as the sole architect of Europe's suffering, as though one ambitious man suddenly plunged a peaceful continent into chaos. Reality was far more complicated. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia were not passive victims trapped by Napoleon's ambition. They were rival empires pursuing their own interests, territories, and influence. Europe at the time was a continent of monarchies terrified that revolutionary ideas would spread beyond France. And some of the bloodiest conflicts began before Napoleon held absolute power. Yet after his defeat, a simpler story proved politically useful. The Congress of Vienna began in September 1814. Officially, it was designed to restore stability to Europe after decades of war. Diplomats gathered in magnificent palaces while orchestras played, aristocrats danced, and rulers negotiated the future of millions behind closed doors. But beneath the elegance was fear. The victorious powers understood something dangerous. If ordinary Europeans continued believing that revolution and merit could overthrow ancient monarchies, their own thrones might eventually collapse. So Napoleon had to become more than a defeated enemy. He had to become a warning. British newspapers portrayed him as a bloodthirsty tyrant obsessed with world domination. Political cartoons exaggerated his appearance into something almost inhuman, tiny, furious, grotesque. Some of these images became so famous that even today many people incorrectly believe Napoleon was unusually short, despite records showing he was roughly average height for a Frenchman of his era. That myth survived because propaganda survives when it is emotionally satisfying, and Britain was exceptionally skilled at information warfare. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British government heavily influenced newspapers and publications. Pamphlets, illustrations, and editorials shaped public perception long before radio or television existed. In many ways, Europe was experiencing one of the first modern propaganda wars. But propaganda alone cannot rewrite history forever unless people need the story to be true. And Europe needed peace desperately. After 20 years of near-constant conflict, millions were dead, economies were shattered, and entire regions had been devastated. The victorious monarchies offered a simple explanation for the suffering. Napoleon caused this nightmare. It was clean, convenient, easy to teach. Far less attention was given to the failures and ambitions of the powers that opposed him. Russia expanded aggressively after the wars. Britain strengthened its global empire dramatically. Austria and Prussia maneuvered for dominance in Central Europe. Yet in many official narratives, the victors appeared almost reluctant participants forced into action by one dangerous Frenchman. Even Napoleon's exile became part of the mythology. When he was first exiled to Elba in 1814, European leaders believed the story was over. But less than a year later, he escaped, returned to France, and reclaimed power in one of history's most astonishing political comebacks. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined him. Entire regiments switched sides without firing a shot. King Louis XVI fled Paris in panic. For a brief moment, it seemed as though history itself had reversed, and that terrified Europe's rulers more than ever, because Napoleon's return revealed something deeply uncomfortable. Despite years of war, huge numbers of French citizens still supported him. The famous Napoleonic Code, introduced in 1804, reshaped legal systems across Europe. It promoted equality before the law, protected property rights, and weakened feudal structures that had dominated European society for centuries. Ironically, some of Napoleon's enemies later adopted reforms inspired by the very system they claimed to despise. That contradiction rarely appears in simplified historical narratives. Waterloo, June 18, 1815, was a monumental battle that shaped Britain and Napoleon into national myths. Wellington's victory demonstrated order over chaos, making him a legend. However, contrary to legend, Waterloo was chaotic, muddy, and frightening. Communication fails, weather, fatigue, and timing significantly impacted the outcome. Some historians believe that Blücher's Prussian army arriving later could have changed the tide. History often feels predetermined after events occur. After Waterloo, Napoleon was sent to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, far enough away that Europe believed he could never return again. There, under British supervision, the former emperor slowly transformed from military ruler into living legend. Visitors described him pacing through damp rooms, dictating memories of his campaigns for hours at a time. He understood something many politicians never fully grasp. History is not only fought on battlefields, it is fought in stories. And Napoleon became surprisingly skilled at shaping his own myth. As an exile, Napoleon I portrayed himself more as a betrayed visionary, fighting for revolution across Europe while corrupt monarchies united against him. Though self-serving, his truth resilience. He was neither purely hero nor purely villain. He censored newspapers, restored slavery in French colonies in 1802, and pursued devastating military campaigns that cost enormous numbers of lives. Yet he also modernized institutions, expanded educational systems, and permanently transformed European law and administration. Both realities exist at the same time. That is what makes him so dangerous to historical storytelling. Complex figures are difficult to turn into propaganda, and so generations inherited a cleaner narrative. One tyrant, one war, one victory for civilization. And beneath those debates lies a larger, more unsettling question. How much of what we believe about history was shaped by the people who survived long enough to write it? Because the winners of wars do not simply control territory. They control memory. They decide which monuments are built and which names disappear. Which letters survive in archives and which stories are dismissed as dangerous. Which leaders become monsters and which become saviors. Napoleon previously understood this, which is why he said, "History is a fable." Agreed upon before his St. Helena death in 1821, though the quote's accuracy is debated. Its survival seems appropriate, as Europe still argues over Napoleon's identity: tyrant, reformer, dictator, revolutionist, genius or disaster. The unsettling possibility is that he embodied all these aspects,